This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Aurora, Age of Desolation, which is coming soon to Kickstarter.
Aurora is a new post-apocalyptic campaign setting for 5th edition that implements new subsystems for survival, exploration, and character creation.
To survive the Age of Desolation, great heroes are needed to go out and explore the world of Aurora. And as such, Aurora introduces new mechanical systems for exploration and survival, building on the core mechanics of 5e.
If you've been looking for a way to broaden the scope of the exploration mechanics and the survival aspects of D&D and making those more of a theme in your campaign, then Aurora is the perfect setting for you.
More than that, you can also make characters with a unique combination of ancestral traits prepared to take on this dangerous new world.
So make sure to follow the links below to get all the latest updates on Aurora, Age of Desolation.
And now, on to this episode. Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are sharing our tips and tricks for homebrewing feats for your games of Dungeons & Dragons 5e.
Characters love choosing feats because they add versatility or specialization over and above what their class already offers. This allows them to take what they have in mind for their class and add in new fantasies and new ways that they might imagine their character coming to life.
If you're anything like us, whenever a new D&D book comes out, one of your first questions are there any new feats? And this is because feats are really easy to bolt on to any character. Although feats are popular, they can be a challenge to homebrew, because what constitutes a feat is a very nebulous idea. Unlike spells, there's not clear levels of feats to differentiate their power. Unlike a class or a subclass, there's no progression across feats. Or there's no clear levels where characters will gain higher level subclass features or abilities. And the scope of what a feat can give a character is really, really wide open. This makes feats great, but also challenging if we're going to make them for our own characters to choose and actually be something that they want to take and use in-game. In general, I think players are hungry for more feats in D&D. I think that there's not enough of them. We want more feats for things like more weapons, more fighting styles, more unique things that we can do with spells, things that we can layer on top of our existing abilities. And so it's really, really easy to get inspired and want to go, oh yeah, I want to make a feat because I like that historical fighting style, or I want to make a feat that lets me customize my spell casting, or do something really, really cool. Whenever you have one of these nebulous little ideas where you're like, wouldn't it be cool if I could just tweak that one element of my character? That's where a feat might be the perfect idea.
So today we're going to analyze what makes a feat a feat. We're going to look at different types of feats and look at some of our tips for how you can start homebrewing feats in your game. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
Feats are all about customization, and more importantly, they're about customization that transcends class. Player characters already gain class-specific features from their subclasses, which have many, many choices and options. And so what we've seen is that most feats in D&D 5e are about giving a customization option, whether that's more versatility or more specialization, for a character regardless of their class.
I also think it's important that when we do look at feats that add specialization, they're still versatile in the options for who can take them. And I think that that's important, that when you're designing a feat, you need to keep in mind that feats should not be limited by who they're available to, except for some of the prerequisites that we're going to look at. But if you make a martial feat that is dedicated only to fighters, well, you're kind of starting to design a fighter subclass, not a feat, because there's a lot of other martial characters, and why not let all of them have the option of taking the feat if they meet the requirements to do so.
In previous editions of D&D, particularly 3rd edition and 4th edition, there were things like feat chains, where characters would create combinations of feats that would boost their characters' abilities. And we haven't really seen anything like this in D&D 5e, and that's not to say that it wouldn't be possible for this to happen, but it is one of those fine lines where you sometimes do have to ask yourself, do I have an idea for a feat? Or do I have an idea for a subclass? It's not to say that there couldn't be such a thing as a class-specific feat in D&D 5e. After all, there are race-specific feats in D&D 5e. We just haven't seen any official ones, and this is our best guess as to why that is.
As always, when you're homebrewing, rather than thinking of the mechanics first, we find it best to focus on the fantasy. No feat is going to be exciting unless it's bringing to life a certain fantasy or theme that people will want to get behind. Feats that let you specialize in a specific weapon or bring to life a historical fighting style, or allow a magic user to hone in on a specific type of magic. Perhaps a feat that allows a mage who wants to focus on ice magic do something cooler with that type of magic. Or a feat that brings to life a Spartan fighting style that allows you to wield a spear and a shield specifically. I don't know what these feats do yet, but to think of those themes and say this is where I'm starting is a great place to have your foundation.
When you're brainstorming, though, it is worth bearing in mind whether or not you're making a feat for something that characters can already do. A great example of this is characters can always ride horses. They don't need to take the mounted combatant feat just to ride a horse. So there can be a very sharp distinction here between whether a feat is necessary to even do something to begin with, or whether a feat gives a character a bonus to do that more reliably, or to overcome some of the trade-offs or negatives that come from trying to do that action. The mounted combatant feat is a great example in this regard. There's a lot of challenges between effectively using a mount in combat. The mounted combatant feat solves those problems.
And while it is entirely important that you have a great fiction and theme for your feat, it's equally important to have mechanics that back that up. If you have a feat that is all fluff and flavor text and really doesn't actually add anything of value to the game, it's not going to be a great feat and nobody's going to want to take it. When you pair the fantasy of what the feat is offering with an in-game mechanical use that players can rely on and understand how that's going to impact their character's sheet and maybe the way dice roll or the way they use certain features, then you're cooking with gas.
When we design a feat and we're thinking about what we want that feat to do, we have to remember that a feat is a really meaningful decision. Player characters, in general, only get 5 opportunities to take feats over the course of a level 1 to 20 campaign, and many campaigns don't go all the way to level 20. Realistically speaking, a lot of characters might only ever get 1 or 2 feats, and those feats are going to be competing with ability score increases along the way. Yes, it's possible to play a human fighter and have a lot more feats by level 10, but that's the exception, not the rule. And so you do have to remember that there is an inherent trade-off to a character taking a feat. Make sure that that's worth it.
You always want to meet in the middle between your theme and fantasy and the mechanical bonus that you're offering. You also don't want a feat that's just math. If you have a feat that just gives you +2 to AC or +1 to your spell saving throw DC, well, that's not very exciting unless it has a theme or meaning behind it. Also, if you are adding numerical bonuses, it's important to note that a character could just take an ability score increase at this level as well. So when you are adding numerical bonuses, you want to offer more than just a +1 to a spell saving throw DC, because the character could have just taken +2 to an ability score and gotten the same thing. So a feat needs to offer more than that, and that's where the fantasy, theme, mechanical bonuses, and having more than one perk all kind of come together to make a useful feat.
Those of you who might have played 3rd or 4th edition D&D might remember feats like Weapon Focus that gave +1 to weapon attack rolls, or feats like Spell Focus, which just gave +2 to a certain saving throw DC of a spell. And those feats have really gone the way of the dodo in D&D 5e. They've been replaced by the more universal increases that come from ability score bonuses and proficiency bonus increases. And this is where we also have to remember to respect bounded accuracy in the framework of D&D 5e. If we had, for example, a feat that allowed a character to increase their spell saving throw DC over and above what they get from their proficiency bonus and their ability score bonus, that's a feat that at lower levels might not look as good as, say, boosting your intelligence score, but at higher levels it lets you break the bounds of bounded accuracy. So we want to keep that in mind when we're putting our math sort of feats together. there's still a possibility that a feat like that could be interesting and we could find a way to make it work within the context of the game, but we want to think very carefully about how to do that.
Beyond this, the scope for what a feat can do is pretty unlimited. Although as we get into homebrewing our feats, there are two main types of feats that we want to keep in mind. That is a half feat or a full feat. One of the things that a character gives up by taking a feat is their ability score increase, which allows them to have 2+1s that they can add to ability scores. A half feat kind of meets you in the middle here and gives you a +1 to an ability score, usually something specific that is in line with what the feat is offering, or an option of choosing one of two ability scores that might increase by 1. On top of that, you gain a few perks that really sell what this feat is about.
Oftentimes, a half feat has perks that are situational or don't apply all the time. Usually a half feat has maybe only 1 or 2 perks, and when it gives permanent boosts or boosts that apply all the time, they might relate to proficiency. So one of the best examples of a half feat is Resilient, which allows you to have a +1 bonus to any ability score, plus proficiency in the associated saving throw. It's nothing glamorous, it's basically just a math feat, but it's useful and players take this feat all the time.
Another great example is the Crusher feat, which gives you a +1 to strength or constitution, and when you hit somebody with a bludgeoning weapon, you can move them 5 feet. It does have another feature when you crit a creature. Now all other people have advantage against that creature, but again, that's going to be limited use because we can't count on crits happening all the time.
In contrast to the half feat, the full feat does not come with an ability score bonus of any kind. Instead, a full feat usually gives characters one gameplay defining, broadly applicable, big feature, and then maybe 1 or 2 situational sort of benefits. Sometimes these benefits might be much more cohesive than others, and the scope for what a full feat can give a character is really, really wide out there. Often these feats, they'll bring very, very big boosts to the characters and are usually playstyle defining.
If we look at a few example full feats, comparing to Resilient as a half feat, we have something like Warcaster, which gives you advantage on Constitution saving throws to maintain concentration on spells, as well as allowing you to use spells for opportunity attacks, and allow you to perform the somatic components of spells while holding weapons or shields. So while we might take Resilient Constitution as a spellcaster because we can still add a +1 and gain proficiency, a lot of people will go the route of taking the full feat, which doesn't add a +1 to an ability score, but instead gives us a lot of useful perks to really turn our spellcaster into a much more robust concentrator.
And of course, the poster child for the full feat is probably Great Weapon Master, which is the feat that allows a character to take a -5 penalty to an attack roll for a +10 bonus to a damage roll. But people often forget that Great Weapon Master also allows you to make an extra attack as a bonus action when you slay an enemy or when you score a critical hit. With many of the best full feats in the game, they usually have like this flagship feature, the thing that the character is really there for, and then those little perks that you might forget about.
Yeah, not that you should forget about them, but sometimes it's hard to remember that you reduce an enemy to 0 hit points and you get to make an extra attack. But don't forget, because that's why you took the feat.
Whether or not your feat is a full feat or a half feat is definitely more art than science. And making a feat that is very narrow into a half feat can be a great way to incentivize player characters to take it. In particular, it's very easy for characters to take half feats because they still get their ability score boost. Whereas full feats have a much bigger design opening, but you really have to think about what the combination of what they're going to offer characters and what their prerequisites are going to be and how that all comes together.
As a good rule of thumb, if you're homebrewing a feat and you're playtesting it and the feedback is that the feat isn't strong enough, well, simply tacking on a +1 to dexterity on your archery feat might be what makes it a great feat instead of a subpar feat.
Beyond the type of feat, we also have to consider what prerequisites our feat might have for selecting it. This can also be a very nebulous thing, and there's several pitfalls when you're considering the prerequisites for your feats. The design space for what we've seen in the existing feats in D&D 5e is pretty simple with regards to prerequisites. Most feats simply require a character to have an ability score of 13 or higher in a relative stat. There's obviously the racial traits that require characters to be of a specific race. Or sometimes the feat might require proficiency in a tool or a weapon or a suit of armor. Very rarely, but with some very important feats, they require characters to have the spell casting feature or the ability to cast at least one spell.
One thing that we don't see as a prerequisite with feats often is a level requirement. I will note here that there was one feat introduced in Strixhaven that does have a level requirement, but that's the exception, not the rule. And generally speaking, I would say that for the most part, steering clear of level requirements is going to be a better option. If we look at some of the most powerful feats in the game, these have no prerequisites whatsoever. So if you think that adding a level requirement to your super powerful feat is a good move, you might actually just be making a feat that's too powerful, and you should consider the versatility and openness of what feats usually offer.
By my reading, the prerequisites on feats are more fluff than anything else. Most feats have very basic requirements, and so it's probably better to think of feats as being something that characters can take of any level. This means that a feat has to have features that are appropriate for a first level character, a variant human, to take it, or for a 20th level character to take it. It's okay if it's different, whether you take it at 4th level or 19th level. It's okay if the feat is more or less useful depending on when you take it, but we have to make sure that a feat isn't giving characters access to a power that they would need, that they wouldn't normally get in Tier 4 play. Generally speaking, the power of feats is restricted to features that player characters can only get at the earliest levels of play. This is why we see feats that give characters 1st and 2nd level spells, but very rarely do we see feats that give them anything like a 9th level spell. Perhaps there could be a feat that did that. I don't know where we would find the balance of that. And certainly the level requirement might be a thing. But I think that more broadly speaking, the biggest pitfall here is don't balance your feats by giving them higher prerequisites.
I also think that if you look specifically at the prerequisites, a lot of them are more there to stop players who shouldn't take those feats from taking them. There's no sense taking heavily armored if you're not proficient in heavy armor. So really the prerequisite is there to say, hey, this feat is for you, person who has proficiency in heavy armor, not for anybody else. And if we think of prerequisites more in saying who the feat is for and what it's going to make them better at, rather than saying I'm going to add a bunch of limitations because my feat is super powerful, now we're starting to work in the right space.
That said, I think it would be really cool if there were feats that had a prerequisite, such as having the extra attack feature, or perhaps a feat that had a prerequisite of being able to cast spells of a certain level or higher. And again, we could look at class or even subclass as a prerequisite for a feat, but once again, as soon as we cross into the territory of a feat that only works for a specific class or a feat that only works for a specific subclass, I think we're into, are we designing an alternative class feature or are we designing a subclass territory? So I think that that's the reason why we just haven't seen class-specific feats in D&D 5e.
Really, when Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out and added extra features to a lot of the classes, those could have been feats, but because they're class-specific, they were tacked on as additional features, not feats. As a final note about homebrewing feats, let's look at an example feat that Monty and I are working on. Monty and I really like tools in Dungeons & Dragons, and we think that tools don't get enough play at the table. Everybody has tool proficiencies, but rarely uses them. So here's an example on the screen right now of a tool-specific feat. This is a feat that requires a prerequisite of having a proficiency in Smith's tools.
Kelly and I worked from a very simple premise when we were designing these feats. We wanted tools to be more meaningful, so we thought, okay, what if we take a tool that characters often have and design a feat around that? What would be a really simple starting point for what you might want to do with a tool? Well, quite simply, I think a lot of characters who have proficiency in Smith's tools think it would be really awesome if I could improve my weapons and armor using my tools. So that's what we wanted to achieve with this feat. We wanted to create a feat that felt like a character was an expert weaponsmith who was really good at building and maintaining their equipment. all characters can craft stuff. So we didn't want to make a feat that just said, you can craft things. They can already do that. We want to make it feel like you can craft really good things. And so the Expert Weaponsmith simply allows you to use your tools over one of your existing weapons, refine it, sharpen it up, and turn it into a magic weapon. And we added a very simple restriction that you're such a good smith that you're invoking magic, but you can only have one such weapon magically imbued by your skills at a time. That way the character can't just go and distribute a ton of magic swords all over the place.
And the weapon that you imbue gains a bonus equal to half your proficiency modifier, which, if we look at magic weapons in D&D, they go from +1 to +3. If we follow the proficiency bonus increases that a player goes through, this means that for a large portion of Tier 1 and into the beginning of Tier 2, they're going to have a +1 weapon. Then moving to a +2, and eventually at very high level play, they can imbue weapons with +3. Of course, this feat only works on non-magical weapons, so probably by the time you're 17th level, you might have a really cool flame tongue or something, but if there's a martial character who doesn't, the Expert Weaponsmith feat will allow them to imbue those weapons to make them more useful at all tiers of play.
We did consider maybe allowing this feat to work on magical weapons. That would be pretty generous if it did allow you to augment a magical weapon even further. That might be cool. Maybe we'll try some playtesting and see how that feels. This is a feat that does allow characters to get a bonus to their attack rolls over and above their existing ones. But it's one that we scale really carefully with the character's proficiency bonus, and it's one that uses the existing mechanics of magic weapons to make sure that there is still a stopgap on that. If we made a feat, for example, that allowed a character to stack a brand new bonus on top of their magic weapon bonuses and on top of their proficiency and on top of their strength, that might be taking things a little bit too far. But because the feat does come with a trade-off, it still uses the existing enhancement bonuses of magic weapons. Yeah, it's a little perk, but magic weapons are pretty common in D&D 5e, and so it is a trade-off in that respect.
And so this is the point where you have to take it into play. Monty and I are going to be trying this feat out. If you do create a feat, always play test it and let your players know that you are trying out something new. Perhaps even run a special session where the characters have taken some of the feats that you've created and get to use them in play. This way you can change and shift them as need be without actually hindering your existing campaign. Always let your players know, hey, we're trying something new. It might go through some reworking or customizing, and allow yourself the room to play around with these feats and see what's going to work best for you. So this has been a look at homebrewing feats in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us what you thought of the feat that we created, or tell us about the feats that you have homebrewed in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider supporting our channel by following the links in the description below.
And don't forget to check out our live play Fate of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more guides for Dungeon Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. See you next time
in the dungeon.